They found his body in a rusting school bus, curled in a sleeping bag, alone. He had been dead for weeks, maybe longer. Inside the bus, there were journal entries, a note begging for help, and scattered remnants of a life reduced to survival. A rifle, a bag of rice, a field guide for edible plants. His driver's license, now expired, still listed him as Christopher McCandless. But in the journal, he called himself Alexander Supertramp. To some, he was a bold adventurer, a spiritual seeker trying to break free from the suffocating grip of modern life. To others, he was naive, reckless, another young man who underestimated the wild and paid the ultimate price. But whether you see him as a tragic hero or a cautionary tale, one thing is certain: he became a legend. And like most legends, the truth is much stranger and much sadder than the story Hollywood told you. Christopher Johnson McCandless was born on February 12, 1968, in El Segundo, California, the eldest son of Walt and Billy. From the outside, his life looked picture perfect. His father worked as an aerospace engineer for NASA and later launched his own consulting firm. His mother stayed home, raising Chris and his younger sister, Corrine. But it wasn't as ideal as it seemed. According to Corrine, their home was volatile. There were verbal fights, strict expectations, and an emotional undercurrent of fear and control. Behind the polished front of a high-achieving family, there were cracks forming. Chris internalized those cracks. As he got older, he grew distant. Not rebellious exactly, but increasingly idealistic. He started reading Tolstoy, Jack London, and Thoreau, writers who championed solitude, simplicity, and self-reliance. By the time he was a teenager, it was clear Chris didn't want the American dream. He wanted something more pure. In 1990, Chris graduated from Emory University in Atlanta with a degree in history and anthropology. He had a bright future ahead. Law school was on the table. His parents offered to buy him a new car, but Chris wasn't interested. Why would law school be on the table if you majored in history and anthropology? I don't understand that part. If you know, please, in the comments, let me know, because I am oblivious to all that. Instead, he donated nearly $25,000 from his college fund to Oxfam and vanished. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. Not his friends, not his sister, and definitely not his parents. He burned his social security card, cut up his IDs, abandoned his Datsun in the desert, and began traveling the American West. And for those who don't know, Datsun is actually owned by Nissan. So it's like he abandoned his Nissan. He took on a new name, Alexander Supertramp. To him, this wasn't just a road trip, it was a shedding of skin, a way to kill off the consumerist identity he was raised with and became something wild, something real. He hitchhiked, he canoed down the Colorado River into Mexico, he lived with drifters, slept under bridges, and worked odd jobs in grain elevators and burger joints. He survived on very little by choice. But he always kept moving. And in letters to the few people he met and trusted, he started dropping hints about his final goal: the great unknown, Alaska. In 1992, Chris arrived in Fairbanks, Alaska. He was 24 years old. He had a .22 caliber rifle, a few books, 10 pounds of rice, some camping gear, and a tattered field guide on local plants. He carried no detailed maps, no GPS, no radio, and no compass. Locals tried to warn him, especially Jim Gallion, the man who gave him his final ride into the wilderness. Gallion later said Chris seemed bright and determined, but dangerously unprepared. I mean, with a 22, bro, there's grizzlies out there. What are you gonna? You're not gonna do anything with that 22 grizzlies, for real. Come on now. On April 28th, Gallion dropped him off at the head of the Stampede Trail, just outside Denali National Park. Chris walked west into the brush, alone. About 20 miles in, he found an old Fairbanks City transit bus number 142, abandoned by a road crew years earlier. It was rusted out and weather-beaten, but it offered some shelter, and it would become the place where he made his stand. What happened over the next 3.5 months is reconstructed mostly from Chris's journals. He shot small game, squirrels, what is that, ptarmigan? I don't even know how to pronounce that. A moose he couldn't preserve. He foraged edible roots and berries, and he read, wrote, and survived as best he could. In many ways, it seemed he was thriving, living out the exact fantasy he had been chasing for years. But by late June, things began to change. The moose meat had spoiled, the rice was running low. He recorded feeling weak. By early July, he tried to leave, but found the Teclanica River, swollen from glacial melt, was too dangerous to cross. He was trapped. Back at the bus, his health declined rapidly. He wrote less in his journal. He scrawled a desperate note on a page from a book. SOS, I need your help. I'm injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I'm all alone. This is no joke. Then, silence. Hunters found his body on September 6, 1992. Emancipated, weighing just 67 pounds, the cause of death was listed as starvation. 67 pounds is basically just your bones. But the full story, that's still being debated. And we have a movie to prove it. At first it seemed simple. He starved. But many questioned why. He still had rice. He knew how to forage. What went wrong? Some researchers believe he misidentified a plant, wild potato seeds, and ingested a toxic alkaloid that caused weakness and paralysis. Others said it was ODAP, a compound that can trigger symptoms similar to motor neuron disease when eaten in large amounts. Years later, Jon Krakauer, who originally wrote about McCandless for Outside Magazine before expanding the story into the Wild, had samples tested and pushed for the ODAP theory. He published follow-ups and even a scientific paper. Still, not everyone is convinced. Some believe the real case was simpler. He didn't bring enough calories, he underestimated Alaska's wild, and once he was too weak to hunt, he simply couldn't recover. It's possible all of that is true at once. As word of Chris's story spread, public reaction split sharply. Some people revered him, especially young readers inspired by his rejection of consumerism, his bravery, and his pursuit of authenticity. He became a symbol of raw freedom, a spiritual rebel who dared to walk away from it all. And I always find it hilarious when there's like all these people that are like, oh, I'm anti-consumer, but they do it on their iPhone on Twitter. It's just funny to me. But others, especially Alaskans, weren't so generous. They called him arrogant, ill-prepared, a tragic example of what happens when people romanticize the wilderness without understanding it. Which is true. A lot of people do that even on hikes. They'll be like, oh, I'm going on this hike. Very unprepared. It's like their first hike ever, and they're trying to knock out like a 12-mile, 24-mile hike. And it's like, bro, you aren't doing that at 10,000 feet if you've never been hiking. I'm just saying. You could ask one of my buddies. I took him on a hike with me. It was a 12-mile loop. It's the White Pine Trail around the Salt Lake City, Utah area. And he had just come back from Missouri, and I had been living there now for a little bit at that time. Dude, we did this hike, and on our way back, he was like, oh, you got to worry about me, man. You ain't even got to worry about the other guys. I'm the one that's going to slow you down. I had to push him for that last little bit to just go down to the lake. We had gotten over that ridge that overlooks the lake area. And he was like, all right, man, we're good. We can turn around. I was like, no, we got to go down to the lake. The whole point is to go to the spot, not 200 feet from the spot. You got to get to the spot, and then you go back. But anyway, he ended up pushing through and making it. He's all right. And if you watch this, bro, love you, brother. Jon Krakauer captured this sentiment in Into the Wild, quoting one Alaskan who wrote, his ignorance is what killed him. The bush is a hungry place. And that's the paradox of McCandless. To some, he was a hero. To others, just another cautionary tale. Maybe both were right. In nearly every note and letter he wrote, Chris signed off as Alexander Supertramp. It wasn't just a pseudonym. It was a reinvention. Alexander, the conqueror, someone determined to master his own path, and Supertramp, not just a wanderer, but a mythic wanderer, a larger-than-life traveler leaving behind the burdens of society. It was his way of shedding the skin of Christopher McCandless, the suburban kid with baggage, with expectations, with trauma, and stepping into a new identity that could survive in the wild. In his journals, that persona seems almost split, like he was watching himself from the outside. Quote, 2 years he walks the earth. No phone, no pool, no pets, no cigarettes. Ultimate freedom. But it was freedom with a cost, because the more distance he created from his past, the harder it became to return. When his body was identified, it took weeks for the news to reach his parents. Walt and Billy McCandless were devastated, but also shocked. They hadn't even known where he was. He didn't contact them in over 2 years. The story got murkier when it came out that Chris had been deeply affected by the discovery that his father had another family during part of his childhood. A relationship that overlapped with his own birth. It shattered his trust in his parents and fueled his desire to escape the life they had built. His sister, Corrine, later wrote a memoir called The Wild Truth, describing emotional abuse and dysfunction in their household. She insisted that unless people understood the pain Chris was running from, they'd never understand why he never looked back. The romantic image of Chris as a free spirit was compelling, but the truth may have been more personal and more painful. He wasn't just running toward the wild, he was running away from something too. Bus number 142, the abandoned transit bus where Chris died, became a kind of pilgrimage site. Hikers from around the world trekked out to the spot, often dangerously unprepared, hoping to connect with the spirit of Chris or pay tribute to his memory. Some left notes, journals, and photos. Others had to be rescued from the same unforgiving terrain that trapped Chris. After multiple deaths and dozens of emergency extractions, the Alaska National Guard airlifted the bus out in 2020. It now sits in a museum in Fairbanks, preserved as a piece of modern folklore and a cautionary exhibit. The magic bus became a symbol, not of triumph, but of how thin the line really is between romantic adventure and fatal miscalculation. There's an eerie echo to all of this. In the 1930s, a young man named Everett Ruess, who I covered in a previous episode, vanished into the deserts of Utah. Like Chris, Ruess was a writer, an artist, and a solitary spirit. He left behind poetic letters and carved his name into canyon walls before disappearing, likely into legend. Many have drawn comparisons between the two, and rightly so. They were both in their early 20s, both turned their backs on society, both walked into the wild and never came back. But while Chris left behind a body, Ruess left behind only questions. Still, the stories converge in one unsettling truth. There is something in an American spirit, especially amongst its dreamers, that calls people to disappear. To trade comfort for struggle, identity for myth, civilization for silence. And sometimes that silence is permanent. So why does Chris still haunt us? Why does his story keep surfacing in books, documentaries, classroom discussions, YouTube comment sections, and tattooed quotes? Maybe it's because deep down we recognize something in him, that desire to leave everything behind, that fantasy of walking away from the noise, the pressure, and the artificiality of life, and finding something real. But his story also reminds us that idealism doesn't guarantee survival, that nature doesn't care if your heart is pure, that rejecting society is easy until you're cold, starving, and alone. Chris lived a life that challenged people, not just in what he did, but in how it made them feel about their own lives. And that's the mark of a lasting legacy. At the end of the day, he did what he wanted to do. Unfortunately, with very little research and preparation. Whereas Everett had 2 mules and, all the stuff that he needed. He was fine, but he ended up disappearing. And you can go and check that out in another episode. The one that I did where I covered Everett Ruess. In one of his last journal entries, scribed inside a book he was reading, Chris underlined a passage and wrote, "Happiness only real when shared." It's not even a complete sentence. So, that should go to show where his mind was being malnourished. It's a devastating line because it feels like, at the very end, he understood what he had given up, and maybe even regretted it. He went into the wild to find truth, to escape, to become free. But in the end, freedom alone wasn't enough. It was probably cold, unforgiving. He might have been happy, but he couldn't share it with anybody. He was by himself. He died in that bus, in the heart of Alaska, far from help, far from home, and far from the people who might have shared that happiness. And so the question remains, did Christopher find what he was looking for? Or did he just vanish into oblivion? Thank you for watching Cracked Relic. This has been my coverage of Christopher McCandless. There is a movie out about him, so feel free to go watch that if you'd like. And as always, sources will be down in the description and coming up in the credits after this. Thank you for watching.